to be here. I'm on the Gun board, so I get to sometimes sneak in and see some of the other presentations, but excited to meet you all. Like he said, I don't want to hear myself drone on for 30 minutes, so feel free at any point to jump in with a question. So I'm Zoraya, Hightower, I use she, her pronouns, and excited to be with you all here today. So I'm just I made this presentation yesterday, so it's going to be a little meandery, so I'm just going to give you some milestones for where we're going. So I'm just going to start a little bit with talking about my own journey, because I think that's usually important with this kind of work. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we currently make decisions and plan programs. Then I'm going to use a case study of Vermont's 30 by 30, 50 by 50 process. I'm going to do a short lesson on how humans make decisions that we can hopefully use to make decisions more inclusive. Talk about where I think we are now, where we should be headed, and then a word of advice. And then if there's still questions left over at the end, we can take those as well. And so I'm just going to start with a little bit of context, because again, I think that's important, which is that I grew up first in Germany and then in rural Oklahoma, which is a little different than Vermont, but I decided to stay in Oklahoma for college, and I got my bachelor's in environmental policy and my and business administration and economics specifically. And so while I was, and these pictures are all irrelevant, it's just a cue to help me remember what I'm supposed to be talking about. While I was at the University of Tulsa, I was at the business school for one of my majors, and we got to hear all of the time, they're like, when you graduate, don't do fraud. Don't do fraud. Every class was like a case study in Enron. They were like, don't do it. And I was like, why is everybody telling us not to do fraud? This is such a, like, it seems very specific. It feels like only certain people would do that and you have to cover it up. It just seems like a lot of work. And I didn't understand then. What I understand now is that fraud is actually very easy to do just by incompetence. It's not something you have to necessarily deliberately set out to do. Some people just do it. And then I went to grad school at the Yale Forestry School, and it was kind of a similar story. And the one that we're going to talk about today is where in grad school it was always engage the community, engage the community. Engage the community early, engage the community often, engage all of the community, not just part of the community. It was just this refrain of like, engage, engage, engage. And I was like the same thing. I was like, I think we all understand this. Why do they keep telling us this? Like, who doesn't understand this? And then I started working, and I found out that that is in fact not the way that the world works. We in fact do a horrible job of engaging the community, much less involving them in decision making. And so I did my thesis research in Rwanda, which was amazing because I got to see the mountain gorillas and a whole bunch of wildlife that I'd never seen before. But it also, at the time, I was struggling with the decision on if I would work in international development or not. I was like, I'm from Germany and the United States, two of the richest countries in the world. What do I really have to contribute in a developing country context? And going to Rwanda actually changed my mind, not just because they had mountain gorillas, but also because I saw that a lot of the people who were making decisions about how to create programs, what nonprofits should be doing, were people who didn't have a lot of understanding on what it meant to not have access to systems or not to understand systems. And for me, my parents had always told me growing up, you're a woman, you're Black, you're poor, you're gonna have to work 3 times as hard to get the same things. And I definitely learned that, but also thought that I could bring a little bit more humility to the work than maybe I'd seen in the field while I was there. And so I did start working in international development. That's me in a tree in Tanzania. And found that it was really, really hard to do the work the way that I thought it should be done. And then just to round out my bio, ran for City Council in 2020, then made a career shift, and I started first working for the Peace and Justice Center as their executive director. That's a local Vermont nonprofit, and then now as the US managing director. And in between that, did some equity consulting. And so I started working and was so 2 of the projects that I worked on was water access, sanitation, and hygiene in Tanzania. Another one was fisheries, sustainability in the Philippines. And both of those, USAID has a rich history, as does most development kind of organizations, of spending a lot of money to not do a lot of work. So, you know, like $40 million projects where you raise the wage of 1,000 farmers by, you know, $100 each, that kind of thing, where you're like, if you had just given the money. And I found that although it had gotten better, it was still pretty bad. So for example, there was a lot of restrictions around how you could use the water access sanitation hygiene money, which means we were talking to companies like MSR about their corporate sustainability goals and how they were going to support access in Tanzania, which was very frustrating because the problem with water access in Tanzania is not that we don't know how to clean water, it's that it's really hard to scale and it's really hard to sustain. And MSR isn't known for their cheap, sustainable products. And so it was one of those things where it just didn't really fit, but we just kept trying so hard to make it work because that was part of the goals of the project. Similarly, in the Philippines, we were working on developing marine protected areas, but most of the people who were making decisions were people who worked at USAID, researchers back at the University of Rhode Island, and we didn't even have like an advisor. We talked about fisher folk all the time, and we didn't really engage with fisher folk at the decision-making level at all. And just to round out that this doesn't just happen internationally, here locally, we've got the Champlain Parkway that we're currently building. This was a project that was designed in the 60s. It was going through the city council. When I was on the city council, nobody thought that a highway interstate off ramp that went downtown was something we really needed to build in 2024. But all of us just decision makers just kept pointing out, being like, the person above me says we have to do this, so I guess we're gonna do it. And so that's what's happening. And so everybody just ultimately pointed it back to the Department of Transportation. And somebody even said, Pete Buttigieg took a special interest in making sure that this would happen 60 years after it had been designed. Although I'm sure if we talked to people, they're like, we don't think this makes sense. He might have relented. So apologize for not saying this, but I'm about to tear it apart a little bit, so maybe that's a good thing. So the problem, in my view, is that when we think about making decisions on environmental projects or designing an environmental program, this is generally the process that is followed, right? So we first, and you might add a step or take a step depending on how you're thinking about this, but this is the general process. So we identify and meet with stakeholders, set and prioritize goals, define deliverables, create the project schedule, identify issues, complete a risk assessment, and then present the project plan to stakeholders. So what usually happens, and again, this is in the foolproof project plan, is we meet with stakeholders at the beginning, and then we meet with stakeholders at the end. So all the decision making that happens in between, they're not involved, right? You get some input at the beginning, and then you do some output at the end. And that is the ideal world of planning and decision making. And of course, the problem with that is that you basically are including people in all of this mess. When things are really high level, they're really vague. You might not even know the decisions that you'll be making in the middle. And then you come out and you test with them again, maybe like somewhere in this area. And so even folks you engaged at this area who are maybe on board with the concept, they're not necessarily okay with where we got at the end. And then if they say something like, oh, well, I actually think the solution should be like right here. And you're like, oh, but we did all of this work. Like we can't go back and like change all of the things. Like that would just be too hard. And so we have these engagement processes where we're asking people for feedback. And then if they continue to pay attention to the process and they're not happy with the end, they're like, what happened? And we're like, well, we can't change anything. Like, so sorry, but thanks for your input. Like, we're gonna keep going. And that's why people are getting more and more frustrated with stakeholder engagement processes and are often opting out of them because and you don't even know if this input, if your input even got considered as you like whittled it down with all of these things. And so as I started working, I more and more took on a facilitation role because I thought that rather than bringing in what little expertise I had after my master's program, I needed to start helping people come to their own decisions, have their own buy-in into the process. And so that's where I've been for a big part of my career. And then that kind of culminated, I guess, last year in the Vermont 30 by 30, 50 by 50 process. So as part of this process, last year, the legislature during the end of their session passed what was called the Community Resilience and Biodiversity Protection Act, which set forth the vision to maintain an ecological functional landscape that supports biodiversity, landscape connectivity, watershed health, climate resilience, working farms and forests, recreation, historic settlement patterns, all of these things that are great. So my role was to come in as a consultant and serve as the team lead and get the public input process for all of this. the legislature had laid out 10 pretty specific questions on what they wanted to have answered. And so the first phase, which is the one that I was part of, is the conservation inventory. So that was an assessment of the existing and potential data, practices, programs, equity, what funding should look like with recommended next steps. So this is really, let's lay everything out on the table phase, so that in phase 2, we can make the decisions around what the plan should actually look like, so that we can get to 30% of land conserved by 2030 and 50% of land conserved by 2050. Again, sorry if this is all really fast. Stop me for questions at any time. And so just to kind of lay out the thing, as the engagement process was pretty quick, it actually started in November, partially because it took us a very long time to agree on how we should do the process, which I'll touch on a little bit later. And so we told the stakeholders involved, which was VHCB, the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, the Agency of Natural Resources, and a bunch of nonprofits like land trusts, TNC, so conservation type nonprofits, who we should interview for this. They gave us a list of people. We reached out to them. We managed to get a hold of 47. We did a survey kind of at the same time. We did some focus groups. We tried to do affinity-based focus groups to do it with people who agreed. So that might be Indigenous leaders, that might be hunters and sportsmen. So we did 21 of those. And then we had 4 working groups to get kind of into the nitty-gritty of some of the questions, and we had 6 public meetings. And so, what was the impact of this on stakeholders? Like, what was some of the feedback we were getting even as we were doing the process? So for people who had not been historically involved, they were really frustrated because they were like, it feels like the vision's been set. It feels like you're only going to specific questions. Like everything's already been done. Like most key decisions that we care about have already been made. So what is really our role in this process? Confusing. So this had already been done, right, by the legislature, and then they kind of decided what the questions were that we should be asking. So we were in this like in-depth research. So like, what does permanent mean? What does conservation mean? Like those kinds of questions. And that was really technical for people who hadn't been involved in the process to just jump into. And then also, and we get this a lot, especially in my work now with Indigenous communities, but also I think this is true of any like kind of very small minority group where they have so many priorities. And now that we're getting better at asking for feedback, so many people are coming to them and saying like, hey, this is my program, can you give me feedback on this? Hey, this is my program, can you give me feedback on this? And that's not even just right, even from an environmental perspective, there's so many, but then they're still worried about like housing and healthcare and everything else. So it's just that they're like, we haven't even done a process to see how important this is to us and if we even want to like really buy into this process and be involved in it. And then for people who had been historically involved, they were also frustrated. They were like, hey, this is really repetitive. We actually already testified to the legislature on this. Like, why are we talking about this again? And then they were actually frustrated that they were now not in their shut door room with Agency of Natural Resources making decisions like they had been in all the other processes. They're like, why are we being relegated to the same process that everyone else is like, where we should be at the very small table making these decisions. And so just to touch on how nonprofits and governments get feedback, most of the time it's things like comment periods, public meetings, advisory committees, surveys, and polls. So we used almost all of these. Advisory committees is actually kind of interesting because we did have an advisory committee, but it was A&R, BHCB, the normal nonprofits. And I do remember very early in the process, because I was facilitating these meetings and I try not no worries. And I try not to put my own opinion in too much, but somebody was like, should we have more diverse voices in here? There's not really any. And everybody's like, oh yeah, there's not. And they're like, should we invite other people? And everybody's like, no, that's okay. Which was a little disappointing to witness, but ultimately it's like, I think that this was emblematic of like how technical it was, is everyone was like, no, we don't want to invite anyone who maybe disagrees or anyone who maybe we have to like wait to understand what's happening. And then comment periods can also be really frustrating because that's again when you're done. And as someone who, when I worked at the Department of Energy as a fellow for a little bit, was the one who was summarizing all of the comments for certain things, it's often not even looked at by decision makers, right? You might get like a 2-paragraph summary, but you don't know. It's a black box of, you hope that maybe some of your feedback will get input. Don't worry. public meetings, forums, or town halls. It's something that Vermont uses a lot and has a lot of strict rules around. On city council, this usually means people get to come up, you get 2 minutes, you get to say your piece. There's no response, no feedback. Again, another black box is my input even getting considered. Surveys and polls is very useful kind of in that red blob to just kind of get more information. Actually less common. A little bit interesting is Burlington did a survey when we had all the ARPA money. It came with restrictions. It wasn't a kind of blue sky, you could do whatever you want. But they asked, like how we wanted to spend that ARPA money. And that was the highest response rate Burlington has ever gotten on a survey, because people felt like their decision would actually matter, right? If they say spend it on this and that's the conclusion, it actually would get done. But anyway, all of these have their problems. And I also just want to note that none of these is actually giving any power away, right? It's all just ways to get input from the community, but it in no way requires you to actually follow any of that input, do anything, which is why it can be so frustrating for community members. Okay, so what do we do with all this? So this is my little lesson on just like how humans make decisions, which is really important when we think about making decisions collectively. Because when you make a decision, you might go through all of this in a second for yourself if it's a really easy decision. You might go through this process over months if it's a really important decision, like where do you go to university? But we all kind of go through this process with every decision that we make. And so let's go through the example of, should we keep doing gun exchange talks? Like that's maybe the question that we're trying to answer. And so there's some objective things that we can figure out, even if not all of us know them, but it's like, how many do we usually have? How many people come to them? How many people watch them on YouTube? That's just kind of objective things that we can easily gather. Reactive, what is good or bad? What do we like or dislike? It's like, does Mary have a bad experience because she always has to put the chairs back, and that's why she doesn't want to do the gun exchange talks anymore. She gets very frustrated. Interpretive, what is important? What is the challenge? These are like kind of the key questions that you might have as you go into the process, and then decision, what do we do? Yes, we'll keep doing them. No, we won't do them. Yes, we'll keep doing them with some variance. And so it's really, it's a very simplistic framework, but it's really important because people have different ways that they're coming to a decision-making process. And that's one of the things we knew in the 30 by 30 process, but we didn't 100% plan for, is some people are just like, I'm just trying to figure out what's going on. Like, what's the information? And some people spend a lot of time arguing about what is the right information? Do we have the right information to even make a decision? Other people have an emotional response. They're like, hey, I'm actually really upset because the Democrats passed that bill and I don't care what it says, I don't agree with it, and I don't really want to get behind this. Some people are like, well, like some of the key questions that we have, it's like, are those the right questions? Like, how do we define permanence? Permanence, nothing is permanent. Like, let's talk about that. And I always have a bias towards this stage because this is where I spent all of my life. And then some people are like, why are we talking about any of this? Let's just make a decision. We need to move forward. Climate change is important, whatever, let's do it. And so when people are coming to the process at different parts, so they're like, I want to talk about this or this or this or this, the best thing that we can do is have a process that makes clear where we are going, what are we going to be talking about, and that gives room for all of those things. So give space for people who just need to know what the information is. If that's all you want, just a learning session, there needs to be room for that. For people who just want to talk about, this is why I'm frustrated, this is what has happened to me historically, and I need to get that out of the way before I can help you with any of this, there needs to be a room for that. For people who are like, I want to have that analytical conversations about like what we should do, what we could change, how we can make it better, there needs to be room for that. And for people who just want to come into the decision-making phase, there needs to be room for that. I'm doing on time. Good. Okay. So I hate to call this the minimum for meaningful community engagement, but it is. So I think this is where we're moving towards. And what we should at least be doing as we're going out into the world and doing community engagement. And you'll have heard a lot of these. So I just want to remind folks that this is not actually what we're doing, even though it is the minimum. So it's still something we're working towards in order to actually do some sharing of power instead of just hearing from people or telling them what we're doing. So engage early and move at the speed of trust. So make participatory process part of the early stage of any process, project, or decision, and build in time for that full decision cycle, right? What we just went through. Give time for learning, give time for just decision-making steps, give time for feedback loops, give time for relationship building. And then decouple learning and decision-making. We're dealing with more and more complex topics in the environment. And so we have to give people that objective first phase, right? We have to give people time to just understand and absorb the information before they can have a decision-making process about it. So decoupling those so people aren't arguing, they're not, oftentimes we just try to do those at the same time, where we're like, we'll kind of teach you and then we'll make the decision. But then you usually have people who already have an opinion. So you are having a fight about what you should be doing, while some people are still trying to figure out what's going on. So just making sure that those are decoupled so that folks who are just trying to understand have time to just understand. Build relationships and recognize the labor of community liaisons. That's another thing. A lot of our advisory committees, we're now bringing on people who maybe are part of the community and are trying to kind of work as a bridge between the community and decision makers. That's a really hard place to be in for those, because you know the decision makers aren't always going to do what the community wants to do, and it's a hard place to put somebody in. So that's a lot of work, and to make sure that they're not doing it alone, to make sure that you're being supportive. Those kinds of things are incredibly important. And then getting to yes, and I think this is the biggest one for me, is instead of using community engagement as a checkbox, making sure that whatever stage of community engagement you're in, you're very clear about what decision the community can actually make at that point. And with the, because lots of times we'll ask for feedback and then we're like, oh, that's not part of what we can change. Why did the community invest time into telling you how they would change the project if they could, if that's not even something that you're willing to consider? And so being willing to consider it, and then also if it's not part of the federal funding or it's not part of the grant, trying to find ways to advocate up together so that you can make those changes. Yeah.
So I'm curious because, you know, in terms of like when I do interviews and talk to people in Vermont, a perception is off that I hear is often that Vermont takes too long to do things, there's so much planning and nothing happens. So I'm wondering what you think about if there is a trade-off between, if it's a false, you know, equivalency that there is a trade-off between like meaningful community engagement and time spent, or if there's, you know, or ways that can be made more efficient, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that that's sometimes a false dichotomy. Like sometimes I think the things that take a long time isn't actually community engagement, although that does take a long time, which is very true. But I think sometimes we're stalling things for other reasons, or like we didn't have the full, like how many times do you go through a community engagement process and then everybody's like, okay, great, this is what we should do. And then everybody's like, there's no money for that. And then you're like, okay, now we'll go try to find the money. It's like it's like, yes, community engagement takes a long time, but I think if you have a carefully thought out project, and one of the things I'll get to at the end is how, I'll get to it, I think I'll answer your question better at the end. I'm not gonna try to do it right now. Oh, I'm actually getting to it now. So one of the things that I think is really important is all of those things are ways just to get more community engagement in, and where we actually want more of is co-design. And so having, I guess to give an example, so working in Rwanda, one of the things that, which, you know, like obviously has governance problems and everything else, but one of the things that I really liked is how much emphasis they put on local and how much they put on local decision making. So for example, when other, you know, when GIZ or USAID come in, they don't always say you can do whatever you want, which a lot of countries do, as long as you know, are providing some money to the country. Rwanda's a little bit better about being like, hey, we're gonna give the poorest 20% of people, families in every village a cow. If you wanna help us with that, great, we're gonna run the program, you can help fund it. But you don't get to just come in and design programs and do whatever you want. This is what we've decided is important. And similarly, they're now, and I don't know how it's going, but a couple of years ago, they started doing a project where they went to every town, they said, there is money already here. You decide what your community project wants to do. We will give you the money and then you can do it. We're not deciding for you. Like, just know ahead of time there is already money to do whatever it is that you want to do. And so I think that's actually where we need to go, is to have more flexible funding and to let communities, and I would say this is most important again for like in my work for Indigenous communities who have so many priorities, to be able to set their priorities first. And then you can find the funder to say, okay, the funders want to fund, you know, conservation, like conserving land. It's like, okay, well, what communities prioritize that? Like, let's do more matching than we do like, oh, well, we've decided we're doing community, like land conservation in your community, like what land do you want to conserve now? So I think there needs to be a process of funding a little bit more on the grassroots side for folks to decide what it is that they prioritize, and then making sure that there's funding to make it happen. That's your question.
Yes.
So, advice for those entering new careers, this is especially for these are some things that I wish I had known when I left grad school, which is to adopt an attitude of hopeful skepticism or creative maladjustment, which this comes from Jamal, I forget his last name, from Stanford University, and creative maladjustment, I think, comes from Martin Luther King, which is to go into these spaces and see all of the problems, but to be a little bit hopeful for them and feel like maybe you can, and problem solve on how to make them better. I think that's the best way to prevent burnout. And then I'm gonna jump to this one. And your goal is to make things better, not to make them perfect. So I think lots of us, especially coming from an academic context, we always talk about, you know, the best design, like academia is much more about like how things would be ideally. And so that can be really frustrating to then go into a real world context where people are just throwing spaghetti at the wall, and try to get something in between that. And then regardless of your role, make it part of your job, not the job title, but your job description, to incorporate some of those lessons learned, just to be the person who's like, hey, I actually think that, I know I'm the scientist here, but maybe we should do, have we thought about how we're going to engage the community? And then this is something that I think has been a big part of my career that I've seen, is being aware that sometimes science is sometimes used as a tool against communities. We always think of it as this neutral thing, but ultimately science often can be bought and or interpreted by people who have more resources. And so communities can be, especially again, I would say Indigenous communities can be really frustrated where we say we have, or planning processes too. It's like we have this process, it's like the science says we should do this. It's like science needs to be interpreted through a lens of humanity. And so making sure we're making space for that process. And then another one is more open processes will get more negative feedback. The more people understand, it's just like a talk where there's no questions afterwards, nobody understood what you said. If people are giving you a lot of comments and a lot of negative feedback, that's because they're involved enough to see the problems. So sometimes as you make things better, you will actually hear more negative things. And so that is, and take that as a, take that as a bonus. And that is all that I have for you all. So I guess we'll just open up for questions.